If you've been with us over the last couple of weeks, you know that we've been working our way through a new sermon series. It's entitled The Real Deal, and it's really just a sermon series focusing on discipleship. Now, when it comes to discipleship, I think we all have a general understanding of what it means to be a disciple. Probably one of the most definitive verses in the Bible is the passage where Jesus says, to be my disciple, you need to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. And just understanding that verse, the implications of that verse, we know that it takes total commitment. We know it means rearranging our priorities. We know it means to live our lives like Jesus would in our context. And so instead of looking at that passage that so often we look at when we talk about discipleship, we've decided to focus on Romans chapter 12. Because in Romans chapter 12, although it may not be as concise and it may not be as definitive when it comes to what it means to be a disciple of Jesus, it does give us a picture of how we can become that disciple. And so through this series, we've been asking a series of questions like, who does God want me to be, and how can I become that person? Today we're going to ask another question, and the question we're asking today is, how can I experience authentic community? Because really, you can't become a disciple of Jesus outside of that context. You can't become a disciple of Jesus if you're not following in his footsteps. And following in his footsteps, Jesus lived his life in connection with other believers, people who decided to follow him. He was the head, and his disciples followed him. And so if we truly want to be a disciple of Jesus, we have to look at that context of the body of Christ. We have to live in authentic community with one another. Now, experiencing authentic community is something we probably don't think about every day. Now, we may not even think about it at all, except when someone brings it up at church or in a Bible study and someone talks about authentic community and what does that really mean? And I just want to encourage you that it's such a priority for us. It should be personally and as a church, it's such a priority because everything else that we do, we have this relationship with God. And Jesus talked about, what are the two greatest commandments? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. And so we were created as relational beings, and we need to have a relationship with God, and we need to have a relationship with others. And so much of what is written in the New Testament talks about how we should live in conjunction or in relationship or interdependently with one another. I mean, everything in our society tells us the opposite. You need to be independent. You need to be self-sustaining. You need to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. I mean, this whole idea of that's how you're successful. You look tough. You don't need anyone. It's totally opposite of what Jesus talks about for his disciples and what the church should look like. Now, I just point out a couple of things today. This morning, we prior to service, we encourage everyone to be here for coffee fellowship. And some people can be here. A lot of you have. I mean, I've been excited. Initially, it caused a little bit of a problem because you were outside talking for half an hour and you just didn't want to stop. And that's an awesome thing to have. That's an awesome problem. I love that. If that happens every week, great. You just missed Jenna's announcements, and then you can read the bulletin or read the email, and you can find out what she said later on. But that's an opportunity for us to invest in, just one way for us to invest in one another's lives. Just to catch up, and you talk and share, and hopefully if someone's struggling with something, that you can pick up on it, and you can ask about it, and you can begin to pray about it. I mean, after service today, we're going to have our first lunch, and at the first Sunday of every month, we're going to try to have a meal where we can just come together and we can sit together. And I want to encourage you right now, when you go out there, don't look for the people you always sit with. Don't sit with the same people that you sit with or you talk to prior to service. Sit with someone different. Introduce yourself. Don't be embarrassed. If you've been coming to church here for a couple of years and there's someone you don't know, we are a small church. You probably know their name, you know what they look like, but maybe you never had a conversation with them. I encourage you, invest some time in someone new. I grant it, you're not going to be best friends with everyone here, but we all need to be interconnected. We all need to understand, last week we talked about the fact that, hey, we're here together, unique, different. There may be things that people do that annoy you, but they're here for a reason. You're here for a reason. And the reason we're here is to minister to one another and pour our gifts into one another, and we can't do that living independent, separate lives. And so today, before we jump into Romans chapter 12, all of these messages are based out of Romans chapter 12. Today we're going to be looking at Romans chapter 12, verses 9 through 13, if you want to turn and hold there. But before we do that, I want to look at a couple of passages from the book of John. One's found in John 13, the other one's found in John 17. And the reason I want to look at these passages in John is just to lay a foundation about the significance of authentic relationships and authentic community, because Jesus had a lot to say. He demonstrated it, he modeled it, he was the example for it, and he talked about it. And so today I want to look at, first of all, kind of a command that he gives about authentic relationships and authentic community, and then I want to look at one of his prayers. And we're not going to talk a lot about it because we have a passage in Romans chapter 12 to look at as well. And so as we get started, if you want to turn to John 13, specifically we're just going to look at John 13:34. And what's taking place here, a little bit of background. This is one of the last times he gets all of his disciples together to teach them, okay? Probably not the last time, but one of the last times. And I always look, when it comes to the end of his ministry, Jesus is like, hey, I'm going to hit on something that's important. Now, I want to talk about something that's significant. I want you to remember these things. And so in John chapter 13, verse 34, he brings his disciples together and he tells them this. He says, a new command I give you. He's like, come here, listen, a new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. And verse 35 is so important. Because in verse 35 he says, by this all men will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. Keep your mind focused on that last comment. By this, all men will know that you're my disciples. I mean, this whole command is, hey, love one another like I loved you. And I just want you to pause and think, how did Jesus love his disciples? Just think about that. If you have answers, you want to throw them out. But if you don't want to talk, fine. Just think about, how did Jesus love his disciples? Because his disciples weren't perfect men. And his disciples made a lot of mistakes. And at times they showed great faith. At other times they had a lack of faith. And as a matter of fact, at other times they deserted Jesus. But Jesus invested time. He invested, teaching. He showed patience. He showed grace. He showed mercy. He encouraged them when they needed to be encouraged. Jesus truly was invested in his disciples. And he's looking at his disciples and he's saying, hey, I want you to love one another. And he's talking about the 12 here, and he's talking about the other disciples who have committed themselves to denying themselves, taking up their cross, and following him prior to his crucifixion. Prior to the beginning of the church, Jesus had other disciples outside of the 12 that he chose as apostles. He says, you know what, I want you to love one another as I have loved you. And I know we have friends in the church. I know we have acquaintances that we come into contact with throughout the day, at least on Sundays, and maybe during Bible studies, or maybe even throughout the week that you might get together. But my question is, are we truly loving one another as Christ loved his disciples? Are we investing time? Are we investing energy? Are we investing, our physical blessings that God has poured into our lives? Now, are we showing grace? Are we showing mercy? Are we showing forgiveness? Are we trying to encourage? I mean, there are so many passages of scriptures that deal with how we're supposed to treat one another. Love one another, be devoted to one another, encourage one another. I mean, if you go through the New Testament, there's like 50-some or 60-some different statements that are made in the context of one another. How you're supposed to treat one another. I mean, if it talks so much about that relationship and how we're supposed to relate to one another, shouldn't it be a priority in our lives? Jesus says, hey, a new command I give you, love one another. You want to know how you do that? Just love people like I loved you, is what he says. If you go a couple chapters later in chapter 17 of John, and John 17 is just one extended prayer. It's the only time in the New Testament where an entire prayer of Jesus, he's not teaching about prayer. He's not talking about what prayer is like here. He's just praying. And John records Jesus' prayer. And we don't have time to work our way through the entire prayer, but if there was one word that I would sum up this prayer with, it's relational. The beginning part of the prayer, Jesus prays for himself and his relationship with his Father. And he's like, hey, let me maintain this relationship. Let me recognize, just empower me so I can do your will. The second part of the prayer, Jesus is praying for his discipleship, and it's very relational as well. And praying that they hold on to faith and they continue the ministry that he continues, that they would be protected from Satan's attacks. And the final part of the prayer is the part of the prayer we're going to look at today. And this part of the prayer, he's praying for, those who would become disciples because of the ones he just prayed for, the 12 he just prayed for. And this is what Jesus prays. He says, my prayer is not for them alone. He's like, my prayer is not for just the 12. My prayer is not for them alone. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message, that all of them may be one. Father, just as you are in me and I am in you. And so once again, we see the relational nature of this prayer. It's like, hey, Father, I'm praying that all these people who come to know me through the message, through the gospel, through faithful people who communicate it, generation after generation after generation, I'm praying for all of them. My prayer is that all of them will be one as we are one. Just as I am in you and you are in me, he goes on to say this, may they also be in us so that the world may believe that you have sent me. Sounds a lot like what he said at the end of his command. In verse 35 of 13, he says, by this all men will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. Here in John 17, he says, may they also be in us so that the world may believe that you sent me. In verse 22, he says, I have given them the glory that you gave me, that they may be one as we are one, I in them and you in me. May they be brought to complete unity to let the world know that you sent me and have loved them even as you have loved me. In these two powerful passages, once again, we see the significance of authentic relationships and authentic community. Jesus is making it a priority both in his prayer life and in his commands to his disciples. Now, I want you to understand what we're talking about this morning. It goes beyond what we can experience on a Sunday morning. At church, what we do is we try to provide opportunities for relationships to begin, but authentic community has to extend beyond what takes place on a Sunday morning. It's a good springboard, but to live authentically or live in authentic community with someone, it's going to require more time, more commitment, more effort on your part, more intentionality. It just doesn't happen naturally. If you look around, most relationships are very superficial in nature. I mean, you're cordial with people, you're nice to people. Even as Christians, we want to show love and compassion, and we do that on some level, but oftentimes that level doesn't extend past what is convenient for us. So when you think about that, when relationships become inconvenient, often we begin to turn and walk away or build some walls or create some separation. When it's not easy, when it's not nice, when it's not convenient, we kind of lose interest in that relationship oftentimes. And that's not what Jesus is talking about here. Because there's so many times when Jesus could have been disappointed with his disciples, where he's teaching them something and they're like, hey, we don't get this at all. Or, Peter is saying things that's contrary to what God's will is. And he's like, get behind me, Satan. Or, times when Jesus was like, hey, just pray with me for an hour, and they fall asleep and they disappoint him. I mean, there's so many parts of their story that shows failure on their part, and Jesus responds with grace, and Jesus responds with encouragement, and Jesus responds with love. And so when it comes to the lives that we live, when it comes to the relations that we create, those types of scenarios don't often take place in the confines of the church building. Authentic community takes place when we live our lives investing in one another. When we live our lives investing with one another. A great picture can be found in Acts chapter 2, We don't have time to look at that this morning, but I encourage you, if you're taking notes, just jot down Acts chapter 2. Take a look up in Acts chapter 2 about what the community life was like within the early church. Paints a beautiful picture. Jesus commands and he prayed for us to live in authentic community in John. Let's take a look at what we can see in Romans chapter 12 when it comes to what we can learn, what Paul is teaching us about how we can live in authentic community with others as well. This is what Paul writes, Romans chapter 12, verses 9 through 13, and we're going to just break this down relatively quickly, and then we'll be done this morning. This is what Paul writes. He says, "Love must be sincere. Hate what is evil, cling to what is good." He says, "Be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Honor one another above yourselves. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with God's people who are in need. Practice hospitality." The whole passage is dealing with these relational elements that I just want to take a moment to break apart. If you're taking notes this morning, there's just one phrase that's going to sum up everything we're going to talk about today. So if you get this phrase, if you understand this phrase, you'll know everything that we're going to talk about today. And this is what it is. It says, when the real you meets real needs for the right reasons, in the right ways, you will experience authentic community. All right? When the real you meets real needs for the right reasons in the right ways, you will experience authentic community. So we're just going to take a moment to break that down and look through that. In verse 9, we can read this: "Love must be sincere, hate what is evil, cling to what is good." If you want to experience authentic community in your life, the real you has to show up. All right? Too often, and I'm not pointing any fingers because I'm just like everyone else. Too often in our lives, we come into groups of people wearing masks, right? Because people have expectations of who we are. And I'm not talking about hiding sin. I'm just talking about we have these masks. We could be, we could have the worst day of our life, and we would come in, and, someone would say, "Hey, how are you doing?" "I'm doing okay." We got a smile on our face, or at least the best smile that we can create, and we try to look like, hey, things are fine, and wearing masks prohibits people from really getting to know who you are, prohibits people from really investing in you. You're creating this barrier that prevents people from really ministering to you. And it's not only you that's wearing the mask. Most of the time, most of us wear masks when we come into contact or when we stand face to face with someone. Paul here in Romans chapter 12 uses this word sincere, all right? And I was going to type the Greek word out, but I'm going to tell you what it is because I think it's important. It's the word anupokristos, okay? I know you're not going to remember that. But the important thing is the first two letters, "an," is like anti. It's like, we'll take antivirus, or what's another anti-word? Someone help me out. Anti-theft. Okay. We'll use anti-theft. So, everyone knows what theft is, right? Everyone knows what theft is? Someone steals something from you. Anti-theft means what? Preventing theft, not having theft there. Okay, without. We'll just say without theft because that works better for my illustration here. Now, anupokristos is basically two parts. An is the anti part. Hypokristos is where we get the word hypocrite from. And it means an without hypocrisy. And so when Paul writes, and there's actually another Greek word that also means sincerity. There's a nuance that's different there, but in this case here, anupokristos, it means without hypocrisy. Now, to understand the significance of this, you have to understand how the word hypokristos, because there's a rough breathing mark in front of it, so you have the H sound. Hypokristos was the word that in Greek theater they used for the masks that they wear. You see, in Greek theater, it was just men who were in theater. So it doesn't matter who the character. The character could be a man, it could be a woman, it could be an animal, it could be a type of weather. It didn't matter. What they would do is, oftentimes they would, sometimes they would have different outfits, whatever they're called, outfits. Costumes, thank you. They'd have different costumes, and they would change their voice, but most of the time they didn't have time to change their costume, so what they would do is they would have these hypokristos, these hypocrites, these masks they would put on, and they would change which character they are. And so what Paul is saying is, you can't live like that. Paul is saying you can't have these masks when you go in certain contexts. Like, I'm going to see my church friend, I'm going to put my church mask on, and then I'm going to go see secular friends, I'm going to put my secular mask on, and then I'm going to go to my family, I'm going to put my family mask on, because it's not sincere. There's hypocrisy there. You're not showing who you truly are. And you may think, what does it matter? If I'm not hiding sin, what does it matter? It matters because we're meant to be a body, and we're meant to minister to one another and to love one another and to serve one another. And if we consistently show, hey, I don't need help, I don't need to be connected, I don't need love, I don't need encouragement, I don't need grace, I don't need forgiveness, because we always have this fake mask on, no one really gets to know us. And so for us to experience authentic community, the real you has to show up. Sincerely, without hypocrisy. We want to skip to the next part there. Next, to experience authentic community, the real you needs to meet real needs, okay? It's about the real you meeting real needs. In verse 10, this is what Paul writes. He says, be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Honor one another above yourselves. You see, when it comes to meeting needs, it's easy for us to meet superficial needs in superficial relationships because, granted, we don't show people significant needs. We don't show the depth of our need because, if people knew the things that were going wrong in my life or the areas in which I had need, they would lose respect for me, or they would think differently about me, or they may begin to avoid me or ignore me. I might be marginalized by the church or by my friends. We think, hey, if people really knew the real us, they wouldn't love us. And unfortunately, that might be true in some cases, but that's not what the body of Christ is all about. We think about how Jesus loved us. Remember, when Jesus talked about this command, a new command I give you, love one another, what qualifier did he have? He's like, hey, love one another as I have loved you. And Jesus, while we were still sinners, while we were enemies of God, he loved us. And 1 John talks about the fact that God loved us before we loved him. That idea of loving us for no reason, loving us when we couldn't earn it, as we just sang a little while ago, and we didn't deserve it. We think about, the reckless love of God. It's Jim mentioned it earlier. It's not really reckless in the fact of God's totally in control, but it seems reckless to us because, what if we love like God? What if we truly love like God, unconditionally, where when someone hurt us, or someone was stabbing us in the back, or someone was taking something that belonged to us or maybe stealing our glory, could we love like God? Not that there aren't any consequences, but we can continue, can we have the perspective of God, hey, this is a broken person, and obviously they need something. There's a hole in their life that they're willing to lie, cheat, steal, whatever for, to fill this void, but we know it will never work. Are we willing to love people who are hurting us? Are we willing to, like Jesus said, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you? Paul says, be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Meeting needs in authentic relationships requires time, and it requires trust and sacrifice and devotion. There's another aspect of community that I want to look at today. And that is this, is the real you meeting real needs for the right reasons. Because hypocrisy doesn't reveal itself in our relationship. Hypocrisy, also doesn't reveal itself in our motives. If we're living hypocritically, people won't necessarily know who we are, and people also may misjudge our motives. But what we see in Romans chapter 12, Paul writes, "Never be lacking in zeal. Keep your spiritual fervor, serving the Lord." Now, I don't know about you, but there have been times in my life where, I didn't maintain my spiritual zeal. Like, I didn't keep my spiritual zeal. I didn't keep my spiritual fervor. I may have been doing what was required of me, even in ministry. You get this way sometimes. I get this way sometimes. Maybe you don't. I get this way sometimes where you're just like giving. You're like, this person needs that. This person needs that. I'm going to try to counsel this person. And in doing things in your own strength, in your own power, you quickly burn out. You quickly, empty your tank. If you're not connected to the vine, if you're not connected to God, if you're not doing things in His power and His strength, you quickly kind of just lose all the joy you have in serving. And so, in those times, what you see is someone he's kind of going through the motions. He's doing what needs to be done, but he's doing them with the wrong motives. And let me tell you something. Oftentimes, people can tell if you're doing things with the wrong motives. As much as you try to hide it, as much as you try to seem sincere, as much as you try to make it look like, you're doing things out of love, they can tell if you're doing things out of love or out of obligation. And so when it comes to living our lives, being devoted to one another, we need to realize that we need to keep our spiritual fervor. There's different translations of that, and some translations talk about doing things with a spirit that's burning or a spirit that's on fire. And we think about, what that looks like, just keeping our zeal, like serving in zeal or loving in zeal and loving with passion and fervor, and the impact that has. When people know you truly care, and they see you sacrificing and serving and putting their needs in front of your own and loving them in real and tangible ways, not just in words, but in deeds and in actions. The power of that and the way that strengthens your relationships. And so when it comes to, authentic community, the last thing I want to talk about today is authentic community is when the real you shows up to meet real needs for the right reasons in the right ways. Paul focuses on method in verses 12 and 13 when he writes this. He says, "Be joyful in hope, be patient in affliction, faithful in prayer, share with God's people who are in need, practice hospitality." And so in this section, I want to kind of break it down into two things, because, to do things in the right way, or to do things in the right way, there's two things that Paul encourages. First, he's like, hey, focus upward and focus outward. And the first part of that verse talks about, focusing upward. He's like, be joyful in hope, be patient in affliction, be faithful in prayer. And these are things that are on our minds when we are looking up. When we're looking at a relationship with God, that's the only place where we can be joyful in hope. If we're hoping in something other than Him, then that hope can fail. In the midst of affliction, what's going to give us this security and this joy when things are falling apart, when our lives seem to be falling apart? What's going to give us this sense of security is when we've built our house on this foundation that stands. It's looking upward. One of the best ways to do that is to be faithful in prayer. It's just maintaining that conversation with God. And prayer is such a powerful thing, but it's such a misunderstood thing. And many people, and once again, myself included, go through times where I feel like, man, I'm really engaged in this conversation with God. And it's going beyond just, the words that I say. I feel His presence, when I'm in conversation. I feel His presence when I'm going through life. I feel His presence, as I'm, just having these quick conversations with Him as in transitional periods. But there are other times in my life where, I feel like so distant. Like, where has God gone? Is God listening? Does He really care? Why am I in this situation? Why isn't He answering my prayers? And prayer is kind of so misunderstood, and it's one thing that sometimes we're really passionate about, and other times we're distant from prayer, and we don't engage in it. And when we do, it's kind of rote and routine, and it's empty, it's hollow. But when we want to experience authentic community in our lives, God has to be a part of it. Because it's our relationship with God that shapes our attitudes. It's our relationship with God that motivates and shapes our actions. And so part of our understanding, part being able to be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, and faithful in prayer, really impacts our relationship with God. He's kind of the impetus that's pushing us forward. But verse 13 also talks about how we should focus outward. It says we should share with God's people who are in need and practice hospitality. As I think about these two statements, the need to focus upward or look upward and look outward, it's no wonder when Jesus talked about, once again, the greatest commands, He's like, hey, these two commands sum up everything that we talked about in the Old Testament. These two commands are epitomized in my life and in my ministry and in my teaching, Jesus says. It's like, love the Lord your God. Have that focus upward. Love the Lord your God, not just, conditionally or part-time. He's like, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. He says the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. If we want to experience authentic community in our lives, it starts with our relationship with God, and that empowers us to live in community with others. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. As we prepare to close this morning, I'm going to invite the praise team to come, and then we're going to wrap things up really quickly. But as the praise team comes, I want to close by reminding you that authentic community is more than what we can experience on a Sunday morning. Right? Because sometimes and Sunday mornings are great. It's great to be here together. It's great, I'm so encouraged. I can't say it enough. I'm so encouraged to see everyone here in the foyer, coming in a half an hour early just so they can invest in one another. And let me say, you have no idea how your conversation can have an impact on someone else's life. You don't know. You may think I'm just having conversations, but something that you say, the fact that you cared enough to ask a question, just being an attentive listener or active listener may speak volumes to someone. You don't know the impact that you're having in someone's life just by being here and sharing with one another. And I'm thankful that you guys are doing that and you're making that a part of your life. And I'm excited for any of you who will stay for the first lunch afterwards. It's great to see people back there eating together and laughing together and talking together. It's such an important part of our spiritual development. We don't think about that. But we have to realize it takes more than just what happens on the Sunday morning. That's just a starting point. And I'm thankful that there are those of you who have, friends that you're connected to throughout the week. And some of your friends are here at church. Others, you have Christian friends that go to other churches. I'm thankful for those people in your life because that's where authentic community begins. It begins when we begin to share our lives with other people. The idea of a body of believers is, hey, we're doing that with one another. It's illustrated for us perfectly in Acts chapter 2, where, you can't be in everyone's house every day. You can't have conversations with everyone every day, but there are people that you can have conversations with. But it takes a willingness to be intentional. It takes a willingness to sometimes be the one who initiates a relationship. It takes being one who's willing to extend an invitation just for coffee or hey, do you want to come over and we can have this conversation, or we could watch this show, or we can do this project. It takes a willingness to be a mentor for someone. It takes a willingness for letting someone to mentor you. When it comes to authentic community, it's about investing your life. And so there's two parts to it. There's one where you're like, I'm willing to invest in someone else, but there's another important one that's sometimes more difficult for us, and that is I'm willing to let someone else invest in me. To really do that, we have to have this humility. And we have to allow ourselves to live transparently. And we have to live without the masks that we so often want to put on. And there's some vulnerability there when we let someone in and we let them know what's hurting. And we let them know that we're not perfect. We let them know we make mistakes. We let them know that we need prayer, not just for the physical things that are happening in our lives and happening in our family members' lives, but the spiritual things that we're struggling with, because we're in a war. There's a spiritual battle that's going on. We don't talk about it much. We don't think about it much, but there's a spiritual battle going on in our world today that if we're not intentional about how we live, we're not going to be prepared mentally, emotionally, spiritually to do battle like we should. And if we're not the people that we need to be, if we're not the soldiers that we need to be, and we're not advancing on Satan's domain, then there are a lot of people in this world today who are going to leave this world with no hope. No hope for eternity with Christ, no hope for forgiveness, no hope for the joy that can only be experienced in a relationship with Christ. And so, when it comes to being a disciple of Jesus, I know there are those passages of Scripture that can kind of sum it up in one statement. But as we look at it a little bit more from a general sense or a broad sense, I pray that we begin to see how we need to reshape our lives. We talked about it already in the second week, where it talks about, hey, don't be conformed any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed. After that passage in Romans 12, verse 2, Paul has been talking about this is what a transformed life looks like. And I pray that will be serious about living in authentic community with one another. We're going to stand and we're going to close today, and my hope and my prayer is that you'll just consider what Paul has to say this morning, that you'll look at life in authentic community and recognize that you have so much to give and others have so much to give you, and I pray that you would be open to that.